Okay, so today we're going to be talking about making layouts and landing pages for Drupal 8. A lot of this stuff is also applicable to Drupal 7. So how many of you are using Drupal 8 already? Building sites, awesome. And Drupal 7? Everyone? Pretty much all of you? Okay, excellent. And how many of you are more like site builder types? Really? That's it? So how many? So of those who didn't raise their hands, like you guys just don't. You never touch views. You don't make content types. It's not your thing.
Yeah, everyone does that, right? We just don't touch it.
I mean, it's something we do. Don't admit to it.
We just don't admit to it.
I think you all make views. Okay, great. So a little bit about me. My name's Suzanne Dergacheva. I work at Evolving Web, a company based up in Montreal. I've got family here down in Atlanta, so that's why I'm here for the weekend, hang out with you guys. I am a Drupal trainer, so I give a lot of trainings all around Canada, North America. And I also do some site building, theming, development, kind of whatever Drupal stuff I can get my hands on. My Twitter handle is Suzanne_Kennedy if you wanna follow me, or you can follow us at Evolving Web. And yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about making layouts and landing pages, and I'll start off kind of by talking about different types of configuration. So I'll be going through different examples of different types of landing pages, different approaches you might take. I'll also be talking about kind of different approaches to creating a layout for your site. And at the end, I'll wrap up with some theming approaches and just advice in general for creating layouts that are sustainable on your site so that everything kind of looks consistent across the board. So what's a landing page? Like you're planning out some project and you're talking to your client and you're planning out the content types, and you go through the designs and you're thinking, okay, this is standard content type, articles, events, pages, whatnot. And then you come across some crazy page like this, and you think, okay, so this is something else, right? So how do you tell what's a landing page? Typically, I think a landing page is something that has a particular audience in mind, or maybe many audiences. Sometimes it's hard to define. Often there's a lot of calls to action going on. There's some kind of marketing spiel. Often I think the reason that it's a special kind of page is maybe because the marketing team can't make up their mind. They're like, oh, we want you to communicate this and that, and then next week we might change our mind. So we have to create this flexible template that can accommodate our every whim. And so you end up with this kind of Frankenstein page, which of course we're used to because we see all over the place, but it kind of has a lot of different purposes, and it can be kind of hard to build or hard to figure out what the best way is to build it. So it can be kind of a challenge as a site builder or as a themer. So a lot of these pages, like the idea is to funnel users towards certain content that they're looking for. So it's going to be a combination of calls to action, maybe some views, maybe just some pretty pictures. So you get all kinds of requirements on pages like this. So for planning a landing page, I think that there's lots of questions to ask, more so than maybe a typical content type that is pretty standard from site to site. So whether you're the site builder on a project or the themer, or maybe you're actually the project manager and you're sitting in the meeting talking to the marketing team or the design team, and you need to ask these questions up front to make sure that the page that you build actually is going to work, maybe the day you launch your site, but also going into the future. So here's what I'd ask. So what are you going to be creating similar landing pages? So a page like this, I mean, you could just build this all in HTML, or you could build it all with simple custom blocks, but then it's only really going to be good the day you launch your site. So you want to make sure that it's going to be useful going forward. So one question is, is this going to be the only page like this, or are there going to be many of them. Is the content going to be curated by people, or is it going to be aggregated automatically? So I think sometimes we think as developers or site builders that whatever content is being displayed on the page, like, of course it should just be dynamically decided by Drupal what the content is. But often the marketing team is assuming the opposite thing. They're thinking like, I can decide exactly what the order of these 3 things is, and I should be able to drag and drop them around. So figuring out those expectations right off the bat is important. Do calls to action need to be reusable from one landing page to another, or are they always going to be different for every page? So maybe you just have one landing page on your site and you don't need to ask this question. But if you've got a lot of landing pages, the marketing team might expect that they can just copy and paste what they've done before and reuse all this kind of content. Is it going to be moved around frequently? It's another question to ask. Again, maybe you need a drag and drop interface. And do you need to be able to change the layout easily? So I think, again, like maybe somebody on the marketing team assumes like, oh, this is a dynamic website. I can just go in and make a new layout and do 2 columns or 3 columns or 4 columns or all of them combined together and drag and drop the widths of these columns. And you might be thinking, oh, yeah, this is the layout. This is how it's always going to be. So yeah, figuring out whether that's actually a need and maybe telling the designer to limit the number of layouts, something good to figure out at the beginning of your project. So based on the answers to these questions and other questions you might ask, you might come up with hundreds of different types of landing pages. So I'm going to kind of narrow it down for this presentation because we don't have so much time to 3 main use cases that might come out of those questions. So first of all, you might be creating reusable landing pages where there's always a pretty consistent layout. So that's something more like a template for landing pages. You might realize that this is kind of a one-time use landing page, something like the home page where there's only going to be one of them. Or you might realize that you're creating landing pages where the layout also needs to be flexible. So it has to be more flexible than just a standardized template, but it's actually something the designer or the marketing person is going to want to change around. So first off, reusable landing pages. So here I'm thinking, okay, we've got to create multiple landing pages that pretty much all follow the same design, the same kind of template. And I don't mean template like there's going to be one Drupal template. I mean like template, that's the word you can use to talk to your marketing people to say, yeah, there's just going to be like a way to set up a landing page and you can create as many of them as you need. And so I'm thinking at this point, this is probably going to be a content type, right? Because I want to be able to easily create more of them, so let's create a content type for it. And then we'll figure out how to get these calls to action in place on the landing page so that those are flexible. And these pages, you know, they're not identical. It's not like they all have the exact same styling, the same set of links. It's kind of hard to see in the screenshot with the projector, but like there's different background images on these. This one's kind of left aligned, this one's kind of centered, this one's got videos. So there's some variation going on, but there's also some a standard kind of look and feel. So let's say these are the requirements you come up with. So you need to create a whole bunch of these landing pages, and they need to look consistent, but the content's always going to be changing. And the marketing team, you know, is going to want to change the content. Editors need to be able to edit the calls to action easily, because the people editing these pages, they're not like Drupal site builders like us. They want just like one edit link that they can click to edit the page, and then they want to be able to edit everything. And that's an important requirement to figure out before you start, because that's kind of a magical thing in Drupal, right? Like, depending on how you build these calls to action, might not work out that way. Calls to action can link to anywhere, so they can be external links or internal links. And there's different types of calls to action. So like we saw, there were some that had videos, there were some that just had links, some had background images. So we had like a variety of different types. And they also had different styles: black background, light background, image background. You can see there's a little bit of difference in the styles. It looks consistent, but these calls to action have, different colored text and a different style of background image. So planning out this content type, some of these things seem pretty obvious. Like, okay, there's a title going on. There's also a little prefix for the title, so that can be a field. You could also set up this banner image as a field. So these could be like kind of standard fields. And then for these calls to action, these are things where, the editor might want to create many of them, or maybe just a couple, and you don't want to limit them. So you want the user to be able to create as many calls to action as possible. So here we're looking at something more like a compound field. So if we were doing this in Drupal 7, we probably would have thought of using field collection, right? It's like a way of creating these compound fields with multiple fields. And in Drupal 8, we also have the option of using paragraphs, which are a little bit more flexible and kind of the new kid on the block. So here's just another example of a similar requirement with a landing page, something where you might want to create a landing page content type where there's a banner image and a title, like standard fields, and then these more like calls to action that you can add further down the page. So the way that I would approach the calls to action, probably in Drupal 8, would be to use the paragraphs module. So this module, it's kind of like field collection if you've used that before, and it allows you to create new types of paragraphs on your site. And paragraphs are a type of entity, and so you can create multiple types of paragraphs. So you might have a standard call to action, you might have one that's more like a video, you might have one that's got links in it or document downloads. But basically they're like mini content types that you're attaching to your landing page. And for each one you can define separate fields. So for just standard calls to action, like something more simple, you could have each one with a title, an image, text, and a link. And you define it something like this. So in terms of Drupal, it just feels like kind of like a mini content type that you're creating. How many of you have used paragraphs before? A few people? Yeah, so it's something really interesting to try out. There's lots of different use cases for it. Landing pages are just kind of one of them. And it's kind of something you can try out for your next project. So the cool thing about paragraphs is that you're not just stuck to one type. So you could decide that all your calls to action are going to be completely consistent. Like each one's going to have the title, it's going to have some kind of a background image, it's going to have the link that you want the user to click on. But in most cases, you're going to end up with more variability. Like in the real world, the designer is going to say, oh, why don't we put some videos here? Or how about some downloads of these important documents? And so in this case, you might need to create some more types of calls to action. So when I say calls to action, are you all know what I mean? You have no idea. Okay, yeah, sorry. I should have talked about that. So when you hear the phrase calls to action, it's like when you're planning out your website and the client says, okay, we have all these pages on our website, but really all we want users to do is to sign up. Or really, like, we just want them to download this document because it tells them everything they need to know. So it's like an action that you want the user on your site to do. So whenever you're talking to people who are into marketing or they're coming up with some campaign, they'll often use this phrase, call to action. And I know there's other things that people call it, but does anyone have any? What else do you call to action? Conversion funnel. Yeah, it's like the key thing that you want your users to do. And so sometimes like you think like, oh yeah, there's just going to be one thing that users want to do on the site. But usually when you're planning out the site, there'll be like lots of different stakeholders and they all want users to do different things. Or you might have different types of users, like this site is actually for this Internet of Things standard. And so there's developers coming to the site and consumers, and then there's like actual people manufacturing products. And so each type of user might have a different thing that they'll probably want to click on. Yeah. So often you'll see these calls to action on like a home page, but then sometimes you'll be building out other kinds of landing pages, like for a campaign, or in this case, for like different pages targeting different types of users. So you'll have them appearing actually all over the place on your site. Yeah, so paragraphs are just a good way to manage this type of content. And there's a few benefits to this. One of them is that paragraphs are something that you can edit directly when you're editing the content. So if I was actually logged into this site and I clicked edit, as an editor, I'm going to be able to edit the normal standard fields, like the title, the little title prefix, the banner. But then I'll also see this section calls to action, where I can add new calls to action, and I can drag and drop them around, and I can edit the fields for each one. So I just have one link that I'm editing to edit all the content for the page. So paragraphs you can have different types of paragraphs. And that means that you could set up these different types of calls to action, each using a different paragraph type. And then when you click edit on the page, you can go and add in a video call to action or a file download call to action. And you can mix them all around and drag and drop them in. And I think it's a really powerful tool for a lot of editors. So when you're setting up your calls to action field, it would look something like this. You could decide what types of things you want to be able to reference in the field. So you could choose all sorts of different types. And the UI is going to look something like this. So it'll be a calls to action field. You can choose what type you want to add, and then you'll have that drag and drop handle on the left-hand side to move things around. So of course, there's alternatives. There's many ways you could build this out in Drupal. I think people are using field collection, although it's a bit less flexible. You could also use an entity reference field. So if you wanted to have like a call to action content type that's completely separate, you could do that. You could make an entity reference field to make a reference from the landing page to those calls to action. And then you can use the module inline entity form so that you can do that editing of the content right from editing the landing page. So how many of you have done that before? Inline entity form? Yeah, so that's a really, again, a useful tool for editors just to make it seem more seamless to them. The more flexible approach with that is that then if you have this separate content type for your calls to action, then they'll be more reusable. You could use them for other things on the site. But at the same time, then you've got this other content type to deal with. And paragraphs is nice because everything's just self-contained. Okay, so that's that use case. These landing pages, if you wanted to have hundreds of landing pages on your site. But a lot of the time, you'll be making some page, and there'll just be one of them. And sometimes, you see this in a design, like, okay, the home page is really special, or there's this one special page on the site that developers go to, and you want tools for them, and it's totally different. And sometimes I work with site builders and they're like, oh, let's make a content type for the home page. And I just think, no, that's so wrong, a content type for one page. So there must be other better ways to do this. Okay, so here's a potential homepage design. Shoot. My slides have a mind of their own today. So you get to see everything in advance. Okay, so here's an example of a homepage. So how many of you have looked at a screenshot like that before? Some kind of homepage that goes on forever. And you're looking at the design and your page just like isn't big enough to see, your screen isn't big enough to see the whole design. How many of you have done that before, worked on that before? Or maybe you've just like looked at sites like this and the homepage goes on forever. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, yeah, like the marketing team, they probably just had this big meeting and everybody came and wanted to put something on the homepage and everybody got their way. So like the homepage just keeps going on because everybody wants their 2 cents, like little snippet of text. So here we see a lot of calls to action. We have these 3 blocks kind of up at the top. Then, of course, we have a slideshow because it's the homepage. Then there's some links in here. Again, more triggers for the user to go and download the software. And then you keep going down, and there's more links to, like, go get your product certified. So, like, every audience is kind of addressed here on the homepage in different ways. So your requirements for a page like this, you need to create a single, really distinct kind of landing page. The content might be reused in other places, because let's face it, if there's this much content, surely there's other places where the user's gonna be able to see this. Content, some of it needs to be aggregated from across your site, so probably using views. And you need to be able to reorder some of the sections. So maybe you need to be able to, like, there's another big meeting and everybody throws their call to action in the hat and they decide, oh, this is actually the most important thing. Let's move it to the top of the page. So that's another requirement that you might end up with. So if I'm creating this would probably end up being like a mixture of things, right? You might end up being able to use views for some of the content, because you might say, like, okay, there's a real logic to how this is defined. We're displaying 3 pieces of content. They're all the same type of content, so let's throw this into a view. You might have some recent news that could go into a view as well. Maybe the thing up at the top is this really unique custom banner. There's only one of them, so maybe you could make that into a custom block. And then you might have some blocks that are a little bit more streamlined, but you might want to use them in different ways throughout the site. So rather than creating like paragraphs for these things, maybe you just turn these into custom blocks. And instead of just a custom block, like in Drupal 7, there's only really like one type of block, a block with your title and your body text. In Drupal 8, we can make different types of blocks. So you could actually have a call to action block type, kind of like a mega call to action, actually, and define different fields for the different components of these blocks, just to make it a bit more streamlined and easier to style. So the calls to action view is pretty straightforward. So this would be useful if you had 3 pages on your site that you could identify as like featured pages and use a filter in views to indicate that these are the ones you wanted to show. If the selection and the ordering logic is predefined, then it's super easy to create this. Otherwise, you might have to create some kind of interface for the administrator to reorder the content or select it. Each call to action is going to display fields that come from the content. So if you have a page for businesses, for developers, and for consumers, then it's going to be easy to define on those pieces of content fields for each of these, like a call to action snippet of text that's actually part of this piece of larger content that you're going to get to by clicking Learn More. So as a Drupal developer, like, I think this is a great solution because I already have my content type set up. All I have to do is make a view. It's going to take me 2 minutes, and I'm going to have this, at least like the raw content there, and I just have to style it. As a site editor, you might be less impressed because then you'll actually have this effect where if you're looking at this page as an editor and you click edit, you can't actually edit these 3 pieces of text here. You have to instead go and go to the For Businesses page to edit the fields that show up here. And so you have this trade-off between something that's very nice and dynamic and logical, and something that editors are gonna appreciate. So something you could do as a site builder to make the editors' lives easier is to put in a little edit link for them to go and edit the content from this page. So you don't have one edit link, but you have several. So calls to action blocks. So you might end up with these kind of blocks that are being used throughout your site, and they might have some pretty standardized fields. So rather than creating paragraphs for these, like I said, you can try using custom blocks. The nice thing about them being blocks is then you can reorder these components as part of the larger page. So if they're blocks, you could say, oh, I want to move this block above here, because they're all going to be blocks. They're all kind of on the same level. And so if you're going into the block interface and you're editing the blocks, then those become easy to move around. How many of you have used block types before? Yeah? So block types is something it's new in Drupal 8. In Drupal 7, you could do the same thing with the beans module. Basically, it's like having a block that's also a little bit like a content type because it can have fields on it. And so you can have blocks that are all really similar on your site that share those same fields. And then at the theme layer, you can style all your blocks consistently. So the nice thing about using blocks for calls to action is that it's in Drupal core, so it's really standard. Blocks are fieldable, so any kind of field you can add to a content type, you can add to a block. So you could use it for ads on your site or slideshows or things like that. Downsides are that the blocks interface is separate from, normal page editing. So your site editors have to be a bit more savvy in order to edit the blocks. They kind of have to know where they're going. And you also have to place the blocks separately. So if you're going to add in a new block, you kind of have to know, oh, I have to go to the blocks interface to add something new to this page. So those are some downsides that you might encounter. But if you've been paying attention to the Drupal sphere, you might have heard of a couple new modules that are coming out as part of Drupal core, like the experimental modules. Has anyone here heard of settings tray and place block? Yeah, a couple heads nodding. So if you check out Dries' keynote from the last DrupalCon, or if you're looking to do homework after this DrupalCamp, there's a really good presentation that Ted Bowman did at DrupalCon about blocks. I think it's called Drupal 8 Blocks, Who Knew? And he talks about these new tools he's been working on in Drupal core. So basically what this gives you is an easier way to place blocks from the front end of Drupal. So if you're actually looking at a Drupal front end, you can just go onto the page, click place block, and put something in. And it also gives you an easier way of editing block content. So just nicer tools for site builders. So these are still experimental modules in Drupal core, but they are in core, and hopefully they'll be tested and improved, and then we can all use them. There's also a contributed module called Block Visibility Groups. So if you're using blocks a lot on your site and you have many blocks to manage, this is a really easy way to manage different types of pages on your site. So rather than just having one big scary blocks configuration page, you have like kind of a selection at the top of the blocks page to manage which type of page you're editing, and you'll be able to place the blocks for that page type. So it's a bit like the context module. Are you guys using context for Drupal 7? Any of you? Yeah, context kind of does a similar thing, like it helps you place blocks in a certain context. But this new module, block visibility groups, it's more integrated into Drupal core blocks, and it works for Drupal 8. So you can start using it. Okay, so those are some ideas for that scary home page that you're working on. And the last kind of use case that I have in mind that you might come across is when you're creating landing pages that have to have a flexible layout. So if you have, you might be reading through some specs for a project, and someone says, oh yeah, we have to be able to create new layouts on the fly. It's something you've probably seen before in a spec, and you just shake your head and you're thinking, oh no, not layouts on the fly. That sounds terrible. And maybe there's good reasons behind it, but it always seems like a lot of work. And so you might have come across this type of thing, flexible landing pages on groups.drupal.org. You are all using groups.drupal.org, I'm assuming. You're out here at a Drupal event. So you've probably seen groups.drupal.org at least once. So groups.drupal.org, there's different user groups for Drupal, some of them location-based, some of them just interest-based. And every group on the site, there's hundreds of groups, each one has a landing page, and you can actually manage that landing page. It's using panels, and you can change the layout of the page as the page administrator. So the result is that a lot of pages on groups.drupal.org, like the group homepage, looks radically different. Like you might have some that have a layout like this with a 3-column thing going on. Other ones have like different widths of columns, and there's many, many possibilities. And so it's kind of nice for the group managers because they can move things around, but it also means that the site looks pretty inconsistent and a little bit all over the place. You don't always know where to look to find like the list of upcoming events, for example. So requirements. So if you're working on a site like this, you might talk over the requirements with the client, and you realize that you're going to have like a whole bunch of landing pages, and they all could have different layouts. And you need to easily be able to change the layout, or the editor needs to be easily able to change the layout to have like maybe 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns, or whatever. And the editor also wants to be able to change the content within the layout that they select. So this might be a use case for panels. How many of you are using panels already in Drupal? Yeah, so panels is a pretty popular tool for Drupal, and I think it's popular in part because it's kind of fun to use. Like you can build out these landing pages and use different layouts and place content, and so it feels pretty different than using Drupal core, and I think it's something people like because they can drag and drop stuff around easily. But it also allows for a lot of variation on your site, which can sometimes be a bit of a drawback. So the panels module works by allowing you to create new pages on your site, or to override existing pages with panels. And panels takes over the page, kind of like it allows you to change the layout of the page, to just say, forget about the core or the regions that are defined for the site, use this brand new layout. And then it also allows you to override the content of the site. So when you set up that layout, you can place in the content wherever you want. So it does seem like a tool that's well suited to this requirement. So the nice thing about using panels is that you're going to have one link to edit content and layout. if you use the in-place editor, which is the tool that comes with panels, it kind of gives you this interface on the front end of the site. So you're going through your site, you're browsing along, you come across the landing page, and you've got these links to edit the layout or edit content. And I think content editors really like that. It's pretty user-friendly if you're looking at a pretty simple panel and you just want to drag and drop the content around. It becomes much less user-friendly if you have a ton of panels and a lot of different types of variations on a panel. And so it can become unfriendly for users if it's too complicated. So another alternative to this is to use nested paragraphs. So I asked earlier who would use paragraphs. Has anyone tried putting paragraphs inside paragraphs? Few brave souls. It actually works. It's like when you're in Drupal and you're experimenting and you're trying out something new and you kind of don't expect it to work, and then it does. So nested paragraphs, this is an alternative approach. We talked earlier about creating paragraphs. You can create different types of paragraphs on your site. So one type that you might come up with is a type for a layout. So you might create a paragraph type for a one-column layout or a two-column layout, or maybe a kind of like a two-column layout with a footer or something like that. So you might have these different types that you allow your editor to choose when they're editing the landing page. And then for each of those types within it, you could define different blocks that the user could place, or different calls to action, or other fields that they should be able to place within that layout. So those nested fields become kind of the content that you're placing within the layout. And so this allows you as a site builder to build out all the content for your landing page, but to allow the end user to be able to quickly change what layout is being used for the page. So it's a nice approach because it's a bit simpler than panels. There's fewer options. So whereas with panels, you kind of don't quite get all the complexity from this screenshot, but there's just a lot of options for users. They're really able to place any block in any region into this layout that they've created, and it can become quite complicated, and you can get a lot of variations that you as a site builder or as a themer might not have anticipated. So you might end up with a site that doesn't look so clean. Whereas with paragraphs, you can kind of tell your user, yeah, you can choose different layouts, but really you have a lot more control of what they can put in that layout and how many layouts they can pick from. So it tends to be, you're gonna end up with a more predictable set of content to theme. So an example, this is like the most boring landing page you've ever seen, created just for this presentation. So this would be an example of the landing page. Maybe you've chosen the layout, you've chosen a layout for 2 columns, and then this would be your call to action that you put in the first column and the call to action for the second column. So these would be like fields within your 2-column paragraph type. So with nested paragraphs, with this approach, it's nice because you're just going to have one link to edit everything. It's easy to switch the layout just from that single link, and you can limit the number of layout types and control which calls to action go where. Okay, so I think we've had enough of content, enough approaches. I could go on all day with different ways of building out these landing pages. But at some point, the site building part's kind of going to be done. And you're going to pass it over to your themer. Or if you're the themer, how many of you are themers? How many of you can write some CSS? Oh, you're all themers. What are you talking about? You just pretend. You just pretend. So, Yeah, so even if you never write CSS for your job, it's kind of important to know how someone is going to eventually theme what you're building. So it's good to think about this in advance. So in terms of the overall layout of your site, like non-landing pages, I mean, typically on a Drupal site, you want to be able to allow editors or site administrators to be able to reposition blocks. And the nice thing about Drupal 8 is that pretty much everything is a block. So when you're planning out your theme, you can kind of assume that your regions should be placed correctly, like they should define a layout. And then when the user or the site admin or whoever it is places blocks in your layout, everything should still work as a layout. So this is an important thing to keep in mind when you're planning your theme overall. Because everything is a block, it's really the regions that should be defining the layout. So that's kind of important when you're planning the overall theme for your site. There's kind of two general approaches to theming when it comes to layouts, but also to other things. You might have an approach where you have your theme in place, and then as you add new components to the site, you have to update the markup so that the layout that's defined in your theme is applied. So this is going to be your approach if you're using a framework like Bootstrap or something. How many of you are using some kind of a framework that predefines some layout for your site? Yeah, I'm sure a lot of you have at least tried one of these frameworks. So in this case, like if you're using something like the Bootstrap theme for Drupal 8, then your theme already comes with a whole ton of CSS that defines layouts. And all you have to do is to add some classes to the code on your site, to the markup on your site, in order for that layout to work. And the Bootstrap theme itself, it's coming with a lot of templates, and those templates already add the classes that Bootstrap expects. But if you add extra components on your site, like panels, or you're adding in some views, then you're going to have to add extra CSS to those new things that you're adding. So anytime you kind of add your own markup, you're going to have to think about adding those classes. If you're making your own theme from scratch, maybe you have some generic classes that you're defining, and you're kind of making your own grid system. The other approach is that you start off with basically no CSS, and you're going to be updating the CSS every time you add a new component to your site. So you add a new view to your site that's supposed to be in a grid, or you add something new to your site that's supposed to be placed in columns, and you write CSS specifically to target those new elements. So how many of you are doing that when you're theming? Like you're updating the CSS to define the layout. So I think that's it's a perfectly good approach. There's some frameworks, although I don't think there's too many, that use that approach. So they come with a bunch of Sass or CSS, and it's got some predefined CSS, but you have to put in the selectors as you add new Drupal stuff. So if you're taking the update the markup approach, with all of these kind of landing pages that you might be building out, you're going to have to be implementing these classes that come with your theme or with your framework. So for example, if you're using Bootstrap, you've got some classes to define a 2-column layout. This CSS already exists in your theme because that's what the framework comes with. And then if you're doing something like putting in these paragraph calls to action, you've got to update the templates for those paragraphs and add the new classes to the template itself. So this is some twig syntax here. So you'd kind of like update the classes in those template files. So if that's your approach, then you're kind of going to be, that's going to be one of the tools in your toolkit, is going in, editing templates, adding new classes. Another thing you're going to have to do, though, is add the classes in configuration. So if you're adding something like a view, this is from the homepage of Drupal.org. Let's say you're adding a new view. You want a 3-column grid. So you've got to get each column in the grid to have the right class so it falls into the grid. So then you're going to be using the Views UI to set up these classes. So that's another task you're going to be doing. Updating the markup, so twig templates, views configuration. You might also be looking at updating panels configuration or blocks configuration to add classes. Updating the CSS, so you're going to have similar kind of tasks. You're going to be looking at this landing page thinking, okay, how am I going to make this 2-column layout? In this case, you're probably going to have to write some CSS to create the grid. There's, of course, lots of ways to create layouts in CSS. So you're going to be writing CSS like this to define those layouts, however you decide to do it. Oh, my slides really like that slide. Everything is a block. It keeps going there. So in general, if you're taking this approach, you're going to maybe start off with some initial CSS, but every time you add new components, you're going to have to update that CSS. And finally, I just wanted to add some notes about just in general creating sustainable layouts. So when you're planning out your site, you're probably not going to have too much time to plan because every project is rushed as much as we have good intentions to plan our projects. But just in general, as you're building out your theme, you want to plan which layouts your theme is going to allow. So even if you're using something like Bootstrap and you think, oh, I can handle any layout under the sun. I have this 12-column grid system thing and it can do anything. It's still advisable on your site to have a limited number of layouts just to make your life easier and to make your site more consistent. So it's a good idea to maybe think about that, document it. Limit the variability of your styling and your layout options. I kind of showed you can set up different calls to action types with paragraphs. That being said, if the client comes to you with these designs and there's like 20 different calls to action types, that is too many. You should say no. It's like going to be way too much work. So limiting the variability, it's probably going to end up for a site that looks more consistent and is also easier to maintain. Making your CSS generic enough to apply to different components is useful, even if you're writing your CSS from scratch and you're thinking about each part that you're adding. Make sure that if you're making CSS for a layout or for certain types of fields or views, that if you add a new view or a new block, that the same CSS does apply or could easily apply. So just think through your CSS and make sure it's not too specific. Nothing in your theme should be content specific, so this is just a general theming thing, but when you think about layouts, like remember that if your CSS is relying on a certain node ID to be in place, that's probably a little too brittle. You don't want the whole layout of your site to break because somebody changes or deletes a node and makes a new one or something. So ideally, your theme should not be so specific. Create a separate CSS files for your layout, just to make it easier for other people on your team to figure out how the layout's defined. And then just add some simple documentation. So I know it's easy to overlook this because we all get busy, especially at the end of projects. But just documenting how your site's going to treat new layout elements, it's really, really valuable. So if somebody should know that if they add a new block to this region, the block's going to end up in a grid system, like that should be documented somewhere for the site builder or the theme or whoever's updating the site. So that's my presentation today. I think these are my slides from DrupalCon Dublin, so these contribution sprints don't exist anymore, and there's no way for you to evaluate my session, but if you have any feedback or any questions, I guess now's the time. Yeah?
Can you explain the difference between setting up the initial template PHP, how it used to be in 7, and going to the Twig engine?
So the templates, the syntax of the templates is different because it's using Twig instead of PHP. That being said, Twig's pretty easy to read and to learn. So like if you've used the PHP templates, it's going to be familiar. There's still like variables that are printed out. There's a lot more templates in Drupal 8 because we no longer use like theme functions to override certain output. We use a lot more templates. What else is there to say about that? I don't know. Do you have any specific questions? Yeah. One other thing is that when you're working with Drupal 8, if you're using like a base theme like Bootstrap or something similar, then you're going to be probably copying templates from that theme. But if you're working just with Drupal core and you decide to start with core and just build your theme more from scratch, then you'll be starting off either using the stable theme or the classy theme, and those themes are in core, and they have all the templates that you'll need for all the core modules. So you really want to be starting off looking at those templates from those themes to see how they're working. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
You know, one of the interesting things is that CK Editor added a widgets capability when Drupal started to adopt it, which allows you to basically create some really locked down WYSIWYG style. So like you want to do a triptych out of, or a jumbotron out of Bootstrap, it just inserts it and then it locks down all the stuff. So you just click and you edit all the stuff in WYSIWYG. It makes for a really slick way of doing landing pages. Have you seen much uptake of that style in Drupal 8?
I haven't seen much of that, but I mean, that's not to say I just didn't notice. That seems cool. I guess that would be good for like things like really standalone pages that are different. Like you want to create a page like really quickly, and it's not going to be a template. It's going to be something that's built into the editor.
You have a bunch of sort of page elements that you want to reuse. So jumbotrons, you know, triptychs or something like that, or even things like comparison tables.
Yeah.
And that could be all kinds of, you have no idea how many levels they are, and you can throw it in there, and then you can put like an HTML template in the page, but HTML templates can get broken by an editor. Where the widgets basically allow you to, let's say you've got like an image on one side and text on the other side, you can have a little dialog checkbox that'll say whether you want to switch it to the left or the right. Or if you want to edit the image, it pulls up a separate dialog box for just that image, and you can't damage the code behind that markup.
Okay, yeah. So it would be less brittle than maybe giving than if the editor was just to write the HTML by hand.
Yeah. Or even they just insert the.
I guess the downside is if you're building out a landing page like that and there's dependencies on other content or images to be there, then it could more easily break, like especially if you're migrating the content. But yeah, it sounds like a nice solution, definitely for some use cases.
There's some modules that do it in Drupal 7. I'd have to look them up what they are.
Nice.
There was a lot of discussion of that in LA.
Oh, was there?
When paragraphs first hit.
Yeah.
We're talking about paragraphs now to do it inside the CK editor with the modern plugins.
Right.
But I haven't heard as much of it recently. Paragraph.
Yeah.
There's one more question.
I just wanted to note that it is possible to review your sessions. They're feeding out the link for.
Oh, nice. Okay, yeah. So review all your sessions. And if you have more questions or want to know about the training that we're doing, come talk to me.